The day my in-laws changed the locks, I was still wearing my hospital bracelet. My husband Derek had been in the ICU for 11 days. A drunk driver ran a red light on Route 9 at 6:47 in the morning. And the man I had married 2 years earlier, the man who still left little notes in my coat pockets, who called me on his lunch break just to hear my voice, was placed into a medically induced coma with a fractured spine, a collapsed lung, and a traumatic brain injury that the neurosurgeon described with so many careful, measured words that I stopped hearing them after the third sentence. I was 31 years old. We had a mortgage we had just refinanced. I was a third-grade teacher making $44,000 a year. And I was 11 weeks pregnant, something Derek and I had only told each other. Something we had been saving to announce at Christmas. Something I was still getting used to myself. When the hospital called my cell phone at 7:32 in the morning, and a woman's voice told me to come quickly. My mother-in-law, Patricia, arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after I did. She walked past me in the waiting room without speaking. She went straight to the nurse's station and introduced herself as Derek's mother, next of kin. I watched her do it. I remember thinking she was in shock. I remember thinking grief does strange things to people. I remember giving her every benefit of the doubt I had. I was wrong to do that. I know that now. For the first week, we existed in a fragile, exhausted truce. We sat on opposite sides of Derek's room. We spoke only about his vitals, his medications, the questions the doctors asked. His father, Raymond, came and went. He brought Patricia coffee. He patted my shoulder once and said, "Hang in there, sweetheart," in a tone that somehow managed to sound like a warning. It was on the 9th day that Patricia said it out loud for the first time. We were in the family consultation room. The case manager was reviewing the long-term care options. A rehabilitation facility, home nursing, the possibility that Derek might not regain full mobility, might not return to the job he had held for 6 years as a structural engineer. And in the middle of that conversation, Patricia looked across the table at me and said, "You should probably start thinking about your options, Claire." I asked her what she meant. She folded her hands. She looked at the case manager, not at me. Derek is going to need full-time support for a very long time. That's not the life a young woman should be tied to. I sat very still. I said, "He is my husband." "He might not remember that," she said. "The doctors said the memory implications." "He will remember," I said. "And even if it takes time, I will be here." She looked at me then. Something passed across her face that I still don't have a word for. Not cruelty, exactly. More like a decision that had already been made. On the 11th day, I drove home to shower and change clothes. I had been sleeping in the hospital, borrowing clothes from a bag I had packed in the first frantic hour after the phone call. I needed to feed the cat. I needed to sit somewhere quiet for 20 minutes and fall apart without anyone watching. I pulled into our driveway and my key did not work. I stood on the front step and tried it twice, 3 times. Turned it both ways the way you do when you're certain you must be doing something wrong. The lock was new. I could see from the keyhole that it was a different mechanism entirely. I called Raymond's cell phone. He answered on the second ring. I asked him if there had been some kind of mistake. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Patricia feels it's better this way, Claire. She and I are going to move in and take care of Derek when he comes home, handle things properly." I asked him what that meant. He said, "The house is in Derek's name, you know that." I stood in my own driveway in a coat I had been wearing for 11 days, and I could not make my mouth form words. The cat was inside. My prenatal vitamins were on the bathroom counter. My grandmother's quilt was folded at the foot of our bed. Everything I owned was on the other side of that door. Raymond said he would have my things boxed and ready by Thursday. He hung up. I sat down on the front step. Not because I chose to. My legs just stopped working. It was November in western Pennsylvania and the temperature was 34 degrees, and I sat there for a long time watching my own breath make small clouds in the cold air, trying to locate one solid thing to hold onto. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number that turned out to be my sister-in-law, Derek's younger sister, Meg. It said, "I heard. I'm so sorry. Where are you right now?" I had known Meg for 3 years. She was 26, lived 40 minutes away in a small house in Cranberry Township, worked as a dental hygienist, and was in every family gathering I had ever attended, visibly, quietly uncomfortable with the way her mother operated. We had talked at holidays. We had texted occasionally. We were not close, not the way I was close to my own sister who lived in Portland, 3 time zones away. But she was the one who texted. She was the one who asked where I was. I typed back, "In the driveway." They changed the locks. She called me 30 seconds later. She said, "Stay there. I'm coming." I said, "Meg, you don't have to." She said, "I'm already in my car." She showed up 41 minutes later with a reusable grocery bag containing a turkey sandwich, a bottle of water, a spare house key, and what I would later learn was every cent in her checking account that she had not already committed to her own bills. She did not ask me any questions on the driveway. She put her arm around me, walked me to her car, and drove me to her house without explaining what the plan was. There was something steadying about that. About someone just moving, just acting, without stopping to deliberate. Her house was small. She had 1 bedroom, a couch that pulled out into a bed, and a tabby cat named Gerald, who immediately decided I was his new favorite person. She made tea. She sat across from me at our kitchen table and then she said, "Tell me everything." So I did, including the part about being 11 weeks pregnant. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and she said, "Derek doesn't know yet." I shook my head. She reached across the table and held my hand and said, "He's going to be so happy when you tell him." She said it with such certainty, such plainness, like it was not a complicated thing at all. Like the future was still intact. I started crying then. I hadn't cried yet. Not really. Not the way your body needs to. I had been managing and functioning and sitting in waiting rooms and answering doctors' questions. And something about the simplicity of what Meg said broke something loose in me. I cried for a long time at that kitchen table while Gerald climbed into my lap and Meg refilled my tea twice and didn't say anything except when it seemed like I was winding down. "I've got the pull-out bed. You're staying here tonight." That was the beginning of 14 months. I want to be honest about what those 14 months were. They were not easy. They were not a montage. I did not find my strength in a single clarifying moment and spend the rest of the time thriving. There were nights I lay on that pull-out bed, listening to the pipes in Meg's house and feeling a terror so large I could not find the edges of it. There were OB appointments I went to alone. There were days Derek's condition moved forward, and days it didn't move at all. And days the doctors used phrases like realistic expectations and quality of life adjustments in ways that made my vision go white at the edges. I was still going to the hospital. Patricia tried twice to have me removed from the approved visitor list. Both times, the hospital social worker, a patient, steady woman named Darlene, who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, reminded Patricia that I was Derek's legal spouse and that absent a legal separation or divorce, my visitation rights were protected. Patricia looked at Darlene the way she had looked at me in that consultation room. Darlene looked back at her with the particular calm of a woman who has seen every version of this situation and is not impressed by any of them. I kept going. At week 19, I had my anatomy scan. The technician was gentle, professional, running the wand across my stomach in that quiet, darkened room. And then she turned the screen toward me, and I saw a small face in profile, a button nose, a hand curled near the cheek. And she said, "You've got a healthy baby girl." I thought about Derek. I thought about how he had wanted a daughter. He had mentioned it twice, casually. The way you mention something you're almost superstitious about wanting too much. He had said he wanted to teach her to ride a bike, and to always check her own oil, and to never let anyone tell her that something was too complicated for her to understand. I took a photo of the screen image, and I put it in my wallet. 2 days later, I was sitting with Derek during visiting hours, talking to him the way Darlene had told me to keep doing even when he was unresponsive, narrating small things about my day, about the news, about nothing. And I took the photo out of my wallet and I held it up. I said, "We're having a girl." He couldn't speak yet. His eyes had been open for about 3 weeks. But communication was still limited, still slow, still requiring enormous effort on his part. But he looked at the photo. He looked at it for a long time. And then, very slowly, he turned his eyes to me. I said, "I know. She looks like you." He blinked. It was enough. I went back to Meg's house that evening, and I felt, for the first time since November, that the ground under my feet was slightly more solid than it had been the day before. Let me tell you about Meg. She rearranged her second bedroom, which had been a home office, and she set it up as a nursery before I had thought to even ask about logistics. She came with me to 2 of my prenatal appointments when I asked, and when I didn't ask, she asked me first. She worked 5 days a week and she never once, in 14 months, made me feel like a burden in her home. Not by a word, not by a look, not by the small, involuntary expressions people make when the inconvenience of someone else's presence becomes too much. She also, quietly and without telling me she was doing it, documented everything Patricia and Raymond were doing. She kept records of the lock change. She photographed the boxes of my belongings that had been left on a neighbor's porch. Because Raymond hadn't even left them at the house, he'd asked the neighbor to hold them. She kept copies of the text messages her mother sent her trying to get Meg to stop interfering. She consulted with a family law attorney without telling me until she had something concrete to say. When she finally sat down with me at that kitchen table, 6 months after I had arrived at her door, she slid a folder across to me and said, "I think you need to see this." The attorney had explained that because Derek and I were legally married, because there was no legal separation, and because Derek had not and could not at that time consent to any change in his living arrangements, Patricia and Raymond had no legal standing to occupy the marital home and refuse my access. What they had done was, at minimum, civil trespass. The attorney also explained that Derek's estate, the house, the accounts, was legally half mine by right of marriage, and that Patricia's management of those assets without my consent or legal authority was a problem for her, not for me. It took 4 more months, a letter from an attorney, and a conversation with a judge, but I got back into my house. I want to be clear about something. I was not interested in revenge. I know what channel you're watching. I know what the title of this video probably suggested to you. But the truth is more complicated than that, and I think the truth is more interesting. What I wanted was to go home. What I wanted was for Derek to come home. What I wanted was to not spend the first months of my daughter's life on a pull-out bed in someone else's house because my in-laws had decided, in their grief and their control and their refusal to accept that their son had chosen a life that didn't center them, to treat his wife like a problem to be removed. I moved back into the house in month 7 of my pregnancy. Derek was transferred to a rehabilitation facility 30 minutes away the following week. Progress was slow and nonlinear, and some days felt like no progress at all. But he was moving. He was communicating. He was relearning things with the determination of someone who has a reason to get there. My daughter was born on a Tuesday morning in early spring. 6 pounds 14 ounces. A full head of dark hair. She screamed immediately, which the nurses said was an excellent sign, and which sounded to me like the best sound I had ever heard in my life. I named her June, which had been my grandmother's name, and which felt like the right word for what I was feeling. Something warm and long and full of light after a very dark season. Meg was in the delivery room. She cut the cord because I asked her to. 3 weeks after June was born, I brought her to the rehabilitation facility. The nurses wheeled Derek's chair into the family room, and I set June into his arms, carefully, with his occupational therapist standing nearby. And I watched my husband look at his daughter for the first time. He didn't speak for a long moment. His speech was still improving, still effortful, still arriving in shorter sentences than the man I had married. But he looked at her, and then he looked at me, and he said, "She's here." I said, "She's here." He said her name carefully, the way he said most words then, with focus. "June." She opened her eyes. She looked up at him. She curled her eyes. She looked up at him. She curled her fingers around his thumb. He started crying. I started crying. The occupational therapist quietly handed us both tissues and stepped slightly back to give us the moment, and I have thought about that small professional, deeply human gesture many times since. Patricia and Raymond requested a visit 3 months after June was born. Not a demand this time. A request. A voicemail, actually, left on my phone by Raymond, who sounded older than I remembered and uncertain in a way he had never been uncertain before. He said they would like to meet the baby if I was willing. He said they understood if I wasn't ready. He said, and this part he seemed to struggle with, that they knew things had been handled badly. I listened to that voicemail 4 times. I did not call back that day. I sat with it. I talked to Meg, who was, as she had been from the beginning, careful and honest with me. She said, "Whatever you decide, I'll support it. But I think Derek might want them to know her someday." She paused and then she added, "Not for their sake." I talked to Derek. This was harder, both because of the communication effort it required from him, and because I knew that his relationship with his parents was its own complicated history, separate from mine, full of things I had only partially glimpsed. He listened to me describe the voicemail. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Up to you." I said, "I know. I'm asking what you want." He thought about it. Then he said, "I want June to decide when she's older." I thought that was exactly right. I called Raymond back the following week. I set conditions. I was not angry when I said them. Not cold, just clear. The particular clarity you find when you have been through enough that performance feels like a waste of everyone's time. I told him that any relationship with June would be built slowly, on her terms and mine, and that what had happened would not be erased by a visit or two, and would not be the thing we pretended hadn't happened. I told him that Meg was June's family in a way that was permanent and real, and that any dynamic that excluded or undermined Meg was not one I would accommodate. He said he understood. I don't know if he did. I don't know if Patricia, who did not call herself and who sent no message of her own, has any actual understanding of what she did or why it was wrong. Grief is not an explanation, and love for your child is not a justification for every expression of that love. I know that, I believe that. But I also know that I am raising a daughter who is going to face a world that is frequently unkind and occasionally cruel. And I would rather show her how to hold your ground without closing every door than model either blindness or bitterness. So I am figuring it out. Slowly. On my terms. Derek came home 8 months ago. He walks with a cane on difficult days. He tires more easily than he used to. His memory has gaps, mostly around the period immediately before the accident. And there are things he will likely not fully recover. He has been honest about all of it, in the way he has always been honest. Directly. Without self-pity. With the same matter-of-factness that made me trust him to begin with. Last month he took June to the backyard on a Saturday morning and taught her, very patiently, how to look for earthworms in the garden. She is 9 months old and cannot yet walk, so this mostly involved her sitting in the grass looking skeptical while he narrated. But he was there. He was present, and he was patient, and he was exactly who he had always been in the ways that counted. Meg comes for dinner every Sunday. She and Gerald. She brings Gerald, sometimes. And June, who is deeply in love with that cat in the way babies are in love with anything that moves and ignores them. Meg sits at our kitchen table and drinks the coffee I have learned to make the way she likes it. And we talk about her week. And our week. And June's latest developments. And it is easy in the way that things are easy when they have been honestly built. I think about the morning of the locked door sometimes. I think about sitting on that cold step, with nowhere to go, with everything I owned behind a door that no longer recognized my key. And I try to identify what I felt in that moment, underneath the shock of it. What I felt, I think, was completely alone. The specific aloneness of someone who has just had the thing they believed was stable, revealed as something that could simply be removed. What I know now is that I wasn't alone. I just didn't know yet where to look. Meg texted me that morning before I knew to call her. She drove 41 minutes to a driveway to sit with me in the cold. She rearranged her home and her life for 14 months without being asked to. She documented and she planned. And she was steady when I did not have the capacity to be steady myself. I did not lose everything the day they changed those locks. I lost the things that were never as solid as I thought they were. And I found out what was actually real. June is going to grow up knowing her Aunt Meg is the person who showed up without being asked. I'm going to make sure of it. Not as a lesson, not as a cautionary tale. Just as the true shape of things, which is the most important thing I know how to give her. That, and how to check her own oil. Derek has already started planning the lesson. We're going to be fine. There is something I have thought about often since everything that happened with Patricia and Raymond, and that locked door in November. And it is this. The way people treat you at your most helpless is not random. It is the clearest possible expression of who they actually are underneath the story they tell about themselves. Patricia believed she was protecting her son. I think she genuinely believed that. She dressed her actions in the language of love and practicality, and doing what was best for Derek, and I suspect she has continued to tell herself that version of events. But what she actually did was look at a woman who was 11 weeks pregnant, whose husband was in a coma, who had nowhere to go. And she chose to make that situation worse. She had every opportunity to choose differently. She chose that. And Meg, 26 years old, 1 bedroom, a pull-out couch and a tabby cat, looked at the exact same situation and drove 41 minutes without being asked. That difference is not luck. It is not circumstance. It is character, built over years of small decisions that nobody was watching, that nobody was grading. Meg had spent her whole life quietly noticing what was right, and then doing it anyway. Even inside a family that often made that difficult, that kind of integrity does not appear suddenly in a crisis. It was already there. The crisis just made it visible. I think about the person I was on that cold front step, with a hospital bracelet still on my wrist and a key that no longer worked, and I think about what I needed most in that moment. It was not money. Though money would eventually matter. It was not legal advice, though that would matter too. What I needed was one person who would just act, who would see the situation clearly and move toward it instead of away from it. Meg was that person. She has always been that person. I just hadn't needed her to be, before. What I have come to understand is that the people who show up like that, steadily, practically, without requiring acknowledgement, are not doing something extraordinary. They are simply living in alignment with what they believe. The gap between what Patricia believed and what she did was enormous. The gap between what Meg believed and what she did was almost nothing at all. That alignment, that consistency between your values and your actions when the cost is real, is what I now understand integrity to mean in any practical sense. I am raising June in that understanding, not by lecturing her about it, by showing her Meg every Sunday at our kitchen table, By letting her watch her father rebuild himself, with patience and without self-pity. By being honest with her, when she is old enough, about what happened and what it cost and what it revealed. Children learn the shape of the world from the specific people who surround them. I intend to be deliberate about who those people are. The voicemail from Raymond sits differently in my memory now than it did when I first heard it. I do not hear it as an apology, exactly. I hear it as a man who has begun, slowly and probably painfully, to see the distance between who he thought he was and what he actually did. That is not nothing. It may not be enough, but the willingness to look honestly at yourself, to stop defending and start accounting, is the beginning of something real, if he chooses to follow it. I chose to leave that door open. Not because they deserve it. Because June does.